So in my last astro vlog, I set about capturing numerous deep space objects in the constellation Orion using a Star Adventurer 2i and a Sony 100 to 400mm lens. In this video, I'm going to show you my stacking process in a free program called Sequator, and then I'm going to show you my editing workflow in Photoshop and Lightroom. But before we get into today's video, a quick message from the sponsors, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community for creators where millions come together to take the next step in their creative journey. There are thousands of inspiring classes covering a huge range of topics such as graphic design, photography, freelancing, and more. I'm sure many of you watching this video will appreciate Ian Norman's class on nightscapes, an introduction to all things landscape astrophotography. Or how about James Manning's Astronomy for Starscapes, which will help you make sense of the night sky and plan your astrophotographs with newfound knowledge. I've been using Skillshare for over 2 years now and making use of their courses on freelancing, running a business, but also Photoshop, logo design, and animation classes that help me create the introduction clip to this series. So if you want to try Skillshare Premium for yourself and get access to all of those courses, the first 1,000 people to click the link in the video description will get a completely free trial of Skillshare Premium for a limited time. Okay, so these were all of the images that I captured of the Orion Nebula. 67 exposures, each 60 seconds long, so just over an hour's worth of data. And as you can see, some of them I marked in red, which had a little bit of trailing due to periodic error, but we don't need to worry about that for now. So this is what a single exposure looks like, and you can see I was using a low ISO 640, to try and protect the details in the core of the Orion Nebula because it's a very high dynamic range target. Now, I didn't capture any calibration frames, I only took light frames. So light frames are essentially photographs of the subject you're trying to photograph. So you're collecting light from your target subject. In astrophotography, there are also calibration frames. So you can do dark frames where you take images at the same shutter speed and the same ISO as your light frames, but with the lens cap on. But it's also important that your dark frames are taken at the same temperature as your light frames. So you normally have to do them at the same time as your light frames. There's also bias frames, and then there's also flat frames where you can put a tablet or an iPad over your lens or telescope and use aperture priority mode to basically take a photograph of a blank white surface, and that creates a profile of the vignetting of your lens, and if there's any dust or spots on the sensor, you can then use those flat frames to subtract them from your light frames and just remove the vignetting and dust. But I found with modern DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, calibration frames are a lot of extra work for very little reward. And I'm not somebody who takes deep space astrophotography very seriously. It's just something I do for fun, as a hobby, and I enjoy it more when I keep things nice and simple. So this is a single exposure, and I like to do a little bit of editing before the stacking. A lot of people say that you need to stack the raws first, but I've never really seen any harm in doing a few little edits, a little tweaks before the stacking process. So first I want to try and fix the white balance, and in order to do that I kind of need to see what's going on in the image. So I'm just going to boost the exposure, and I'm also going to boost the vibrance and the saturation just so I can see what colors are in the image and to try and get a good white balance. So you can use the dropper tool, try and find a neutral region of the image to balance the colors, but most of the time I prefer to sort of tweak things by eye. And because my camera is astro modified, these white balance settings are going to be pretty meaningless to you because the tint gets heavily affected in the raw files of astro modified cameras. But I'm just going to play about until I can see some nice separation in the colors in the nebula, and when I feel the background sky is as neutral as it can be with no color cast. Somewhere around there looks pretty good to me, and it's important to have your screen color calibrated in order to get good colors. But I'm just going to reset the exposure, vibrance and saturation. And then I'm going to come into the tone curve, and I'm going to use the sliders here. So I'm going to lift the shadow regions just to pull out a bit of detail and see what I'm working with, and then complement that with darks. Now you can start to see a little bit more of the nebulosity coming out. But you want to be careful not to overexpose the highlights in the core because it's very bright. So you might bring the highlights down a little bit, and then I'm going to further recover those highlights in the basic tab, just bringing the highlights down, and then you can see that detail coming back. I'm also going to try and fix the vignetting a little bit, so I'm going to come into lens correction, turn on the profile correction, turn on the chromatic aberration correction, and if I boost the exposure again temporarily, we can see that that still hasn't fixed the vignetting. So I'm going to keep boosting the vignetting. That's fixed it a little bit more, but there's still a little bit of a vignette going on. But I'm going to fix that later in Photoshop. And it's important to make sure that distortion is on 0. Otherwise, when you stack your images, you end up with really awful patterns in the stacked images, sort of circular patterns. So you want to make sure that distortion is set to 0. And after another little look at this image, I kind of feel like there's a bit of a green cast going on. So I might just shift the white balance again to something a bit more neutral. So that looks a lot better. Now I'm going to reset the exposure. And then lastly, in the detail tab, I'm going to remove Lightroom's automatic sharpening because that does sharpen the noise. I'd rather sharpen after stacking and after a lot of the noise has been removed. So sharpening to 0, noise reduction on 0. But I don't mind leaving the color noise reduction to 25 just to get rid of a bit of the blotchy colors in the darker regions. So now that I've done my basic edits, I'm going to press Ctrl and A. That selects all of the images, as you can see in the strip on the bottom. And then I'm going to press Sync. And then when this pop-up comes up, just make sure to press Check All and Synchronize. Once I've done that, I press G to come back into grid mode. All of the images are still selected. And so I'm just going to come to File, Export, and you can choose where you want to store your files. I'm just going to chuck them on the desktop, put them in a subfolder, Orion, TIFF, rename to whatever you want, and then I'm going to export as TIFF, no compression, color space as sRGB. I'm going to leave the bit depth as 16 bits per component. Don't want any resizing, so untick resizing. Don't want any output sharpening, so untick output sharpening, and then I can export. Now in Sequitur, I'm going to double click on star images, guide myself to the Orion TIFF folder, select them all, open. If you did take dark frames and flat frames, you'd add them to noise images and vignetted images, but as I mentioned, I didn't take any calibration frames. I'm going to come down to composition. Align stars is checked. I'm going to choose select best pixels and ramp this up to strict. And this is going to deal with the images that weren't tracked so well. So those images that had periodic error, this is going to deal with that for you. Sky region, full area, auto brightness off. I just leave most of these off for my deep space work. And now I need to choose an output folder. So coming back to Lightroom, I like to create a dated folder with a subfolder for the raw files. But I'm just going to come to this folder here, right mouse click, show in Explorer. I'm going to select that folder, copy the path of that folder, and that's where I'm going to save my image. So I'm going to paste the folder there. I'm going to save this as Orion tutorial, and then I'm just going to press start and let Sequitur do the stacking process for me. Now that that's finished, I'm going to press close, come back into Lightroom, right mouse click the folder where I saved the file, click on synchronize folder, and there you can see a box for import new photos in brackets 1 because there's one new photo, and then I'm going to synchronize. So this here is my stacked image, and now I'm going to take this into Photoshop. First thing you really want to do is stretch the data. So if I just bring up the levels adjustment, and I normally do by stretching in levels, you can also do it in curves, but the process I normally like to do is bring up the black point until it's sort of touching the start of the data. You don't want to go too far because it will clip the data and you'll lose information and details. You want to just bring it up a little bit closer to the edge of this peak, and then using the mid-tone slider to brighten the image and bring out some of that detail. And you want to do this sort of step by step and bit by bit, rather than doing it in one foul swoop. It's best to sort of take your time and just add a little bit of brightness to those mid-tones. And if I just zoom in, just to make sure I'm not ruining the stars too much, we're looking pretty good. So with the levels, I find that if you adjust the white slider, you end up bloating the stars very quickly. So I like to do it in the mid-tones instead. And again, just making sure that I'm not blowing out the highlights. So I might do another level stretch. Again, I'm going to bring up the black point a little bit, not too much, I don't want to clip any of that data. And then brighten the midtones by bringing the midtone slider down, bringing out a bit of that detail. Now as you can see, there's still quite a vignette in my image, bit of a color cast in the middle as well, and there's a plugin that I like to use called Gradient Exterminator. So what I'm going to do first is create a stamp visible layer by pressing Control, Shift, Alt and E, or on a Mac it's Control, Shift, Option and E. This creates a stamp visible layer. So I'm just going to take the lasso tool and I'm going to select around my subject. Then I'm going to Control, Shift and I for inverse. So I've now selected the inverse, I've selected the sky. I'm going to come up to Filter, RC Astro, Gradient Exterminator. But I'm just going to leave the detail on medium, the aggressiveness on medium, and I'm going to untick balance background color. If there was a heavy cast from light pollution, for example, like a heavy yellow cast, then the balance background color can really help you out sometimes. But for this, I find that this image is quite neutral in its colors, so I'm just going to leave balance background color unticked. And if I deselect by pressing Control and D, and you can see that it's done an amazing job of getting rid of the gradients and the vignetting. So this is the before, and then this is the after. You can see a really nice flat image, no vignetting, no gradients. It's just done a really, really good job. And if it hasn't done a good job, you can run Gradient Exterminator again on low setting and just refine the gradient further. But I'm just going to quickly increase brightness and contrast because there's a few dust spots on my sensor which I need to clean up. So I'm going to create a new layer above my Gradient Exterminator layer and just double check for any dust spots. And I'm going to use the spot healing brush tool and just get rid of that dust spot there. I'm going to create another new layer above here because I told you guys I'd show you a way to fix this issue here with the Sony 100-400mm. Some other telephoto lenses will exhibit a similar issue where there's a sort of dark spikes, star spike pattern to the stars, especially the big stars and especially stars that are closer to the edge of the frame. I'm just going to zoom in, but not zoom in that much. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to select most of this star, make sure I'm on my clone stamp visible layer, Control C for copy, Control V for paste, and then Control and T, and I'm going to rotate the star sort of 90 degrees, and I'm now going to create a layer mask, and then taking a black brush, adjust the size, make sure the hardness is on 0, and I'm just going to first of all paint off the edge and increase the opacity a bit. So paint off the edge so that it blends in a lot better, and now I'm going to paint away the darker regions here. I kind of went too far that side. I might want to move this layer as well to align it a little bit better. Something like that. Take a white brush, make sure I'm on the layer mask. Ooh, white brush. And sort of fixed those dark spikes. So you basically duplicate the star, rotate it 90 degrees, and then use a layer mask. But you can also see now there's duplicated stars as well, so you might want to come in with the spot removal tool on a new layer and just use the spot removal tool to get rid of those duplicated stars. Obviously you can spend a bit more time cleaning this up, but that's how you go about fixing those horrible dark spiky patterns. Anyway, I'm going to delete this brightness contrast layer. Now I want to add some creative contrast. So quite happy with the levels. We've pulled a bit of detail out of the darker areas. So I'm just going to bring up a curves, and using curves you can target particular areas quite well. So I'm going to take this finger slider here, find a sort of medium brightness area of my target, click and drag up to brighten those regions, and then I'm going to choose a dark background of sky, click and drag down to bring the sky darkness back. So don't go too far, you can do it sort of bit by bit, somewhere around there. You can make fine adjustments using the arrow keys as well. So I'm selecting that spot there, using the arrow keys to fine tune. That's added some nice contrast, but we want to be careful of blowing out the stars, bloating the stars, as you can see here, really bloating the stars. And also being careful of the detail in the core. So I'm going to come to this layer mask, press B for brush, make sure I'm on a black brush, and just using a soft brush with a low opacity, 10-15%, I'm just going to paint over the core just to bring back some of that detail that was starting to blow out. And then I'm going to come back in the curves just to protect the stars in the brighter regions. I'm just going to pull the curve down here just to make sure I'm not blowing the stars out too much. And that looks good. And I'm going to do another curve, so I'm going to continue to add some contrast to the nebula. And again, I'm just going to use that finger slider, brighten that region. Now you can see a lot more detail in the faint regions. You can see the histogram starting to stretch out. And then I'm just going to choose the backdrop of sky bring that down, bring some contrast back in, and then I'm going to bring the top of the curve down just to protect the brighter regions and the stars from bloating too much. And then I'm going to make sure I'm on the layer mask and using a black brush with low opacity. Just going to remove a bit of the effect from the core just to protect that detail in the core. Maybe this bright star here, it's getting too bright. So that's looking good. Now there's a nice bit of contrast in there. And in order to make the nebula stand out a bit better, I'm going to create a stamp visible layer. And I'm going to select the stars by doing select, color range, highlights. And you want to adjust the fuzziness and the range until you've got most of the stars selected. But you don't want to select too much of the nebula. But it's very difficult because of that bright core. But we can fix that later anyway. And then zooming in. Just want to make sure that the stars are completely selected. So I'm going to go to select, modify, expand, try 1 pixel, just to make sure the stars completely selected. I think I'm going to go 1 more pixel. So select, modify, expand, 1 pixel. And then I'm going to do select, modify, feather, just to feather out the selection a bit by 1 pixel. And then filter, other, minimum, and then somewhere between 0.3 and 0.8 is usually pretty good. Let's start with 0.6, and you want to make sure the preserve is set to roundness. And I'm just going to click OK, zoom out, press Ctrl and H to hide the ants, and then a before and an after. So just reduce the stars a little bit, and I might do it again. So my selection is still active. I'm going to do filter, other, minimum, and you can see the preview here. Just going to run that again, so you can see the before and the after. Just removes a lot of the chaos, helps the nebula stand out a lot better. Now I want to add a bit of clarity to the nebula, so I'm going to duplicate this layer here by dragging it to the plus symbol. Then I'm going to do filter, other, high pass, and you want somewhere between 30 and 100 depending on your target. You want to get a bit of sort of clarity in the target, so somewhere around there looks good for me. And then you change the blend mode to either overlay, which can be pretty harsh, or soft light, which is normally a little bit better. So as you can see, it just adds a lot of clarity to the nebula, but it's affecting the entire image. So I'm going to add a layer mask, press Ctrl and I to inverse the layer mask so it's now black, pressing B for brush, and then making sure my brush is white. With a low opacity, I'm just going to brush in some of that clarity to the nebula so that I'm not affecting the entire image. I'm just adding clarity to the nebula. So that's the before, you can see it's very soft, and then the after, a bit more clarity and contrast in the nebula itself. Now I'm getting to a point where I'm pretty happy with the image. Sometimes it's nice to play with the colors, and to do that I normally use a selective color adjustment and also a color balance adjustment. So in the selective color we can adjust the color of various colors. So I might come into the magenta and just sort of play with the sliders, and you can see that it's affecting the magentas in the image. Just want to try and create a bit of separation between the pink tone of the core and then the sort of purpley blue outer gas. So I'm going to increase the cyan just a little bit, play with the magenta until it looks good. Adjust the yellows and the blues. So I might add a little bit of yellow here because I'm probably going to exaggerate the blues a little bit. So I'm going to try the blue channel now. This is where we can target the outer gases, so I'm going to add a little bit of cyan, decrease the yellows, essentially add in blue. Try the magenta channel. Might reduce that just a little bit, just to add some separation from the core. I think the cyan's got a bit too much there. So it's very subtle, but it adds a bit of separation between the colors. And then in color balance, you can basically change the colors of the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. Sometimes I like to add a touch of blue to the shadows. Just 1 or 2 is usually enough. Just helps cool the image off a little bit, but not too much. And then maybe some warmth in the highlights. Just adds a bit of color contrast to the image again, just keeping things very subtle. And then I'm going to just crop my image, probably to a square crop. And that is it. That is my final image and my very simple, basic, straightforward, quick and easy workflow. But now I can also save this image back into Lightroom and then do some final tweaks in Lightroom. So I might just bring the highlights down a little bit just to bring some of that core back, only a touch. I'm going to boost the whites to try and improve the contrast. Counteract that with the highlights recovery. And then maybe add a little bit of contrast just to finish it off. And then you can go 100 on the clarity. No, I'm kidding. And I'm not enjoying the cyan around the stars. So I might come into the HSL, come to the hue, see if I can adjust the hue of those stars. Whoop. So adjusting the blue just helps to take the edge off that cyan because it was very distracting. And I might just add a little touch of vibrance. And that is now my final image. And that is it, guys. A nice, simple, straightforward approach to deep sky editing with no calibration frames and still getting pretty decent results. So if you're going out to enjoy the night sky anytime soon, I wish you good luck and clear skies.